Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Ethical Considerations for Insurance Regulators. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a housekeeping item. SOFHI Continuing Regulatory Education CRE credits eligible for 2 credits. To receive credit and a CRE certificate, you must take the quiz located at the following URL. The link is the same link that is used for the SOFHI reading quizzes. Again, please note the URL that you need to access. At this time, I will hand the presentation over to Jennifer Kelly to introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Mary. Our first presenter is Jan Monk. She has over 20 years of insurance regulatory experience and frequently presents at SOFHI, state training, and other venues. She has experience in financial examination and analysis and troubled company regulation. Our next presenter is Eric Scott. Eric has over 18 years of experience providing troubled company and receivership advisory consulting services to clients focusing in the insurance industry. He is former Ethics Commissioned prosecutor for the state of Florida and conducts numerous internal and external training programs related to troubled companies. I'm now going to turn it over to Eric to go over the objectives. Eric?
Thanks, Jennifer. Welcome to our ethics webinar. Today we're going to talk about ethics in the context of insurance regulators and examiners, and hopefully we're going to address some ethics concepts that will be relevant to you in your working life. We're going to start broadly with a look at ethics theory and the elements of a typical ethics code, and then we're going to get a little more focused and examine the proposed SOPHI Code of Conduct. We're also going to discuss public records laws, an issue that a lot of people don't think about, but one that can arise when you're dealing with the state regulator. We will talk about these far-reaching laws and how they can potentially impact you. Finally, we're going to discuss some ethics situations that come up at companies in the day-to-day life of examiners and analysts, and we're going to run through some real-world examples and situations that can come up. Now Jan's going to jump into what exactly we're talking about when we say ethics.
Thanks, Eric, and welcome everybody to our presentation today. Ethics is defined as a moral philosophy or code of morals practiced by a person or group of people. It's often memorialized in a formal code of ethics so that everyone within the group of people has the same understanding of what is expected in terms of behavior for the groups of individuals. And they can be subject to multiple codes, such as a code from your employer, a code from a professional association, a code from a civil organization, etc. What is ethics? Ethics includes standards of right and wrong, what is expected from society in terms of behaviors to engage in and behaviors to refrain from. Since they're expectations of society, ethical matters can, and sometimes are, considered differently from society to society. For example, in some parts of the world, bribery is not considered an ethical lapse. Yes, it is. Another example, some states find it ethically unacceptable to accept any type of a gift from a vendor, even a cup of coffee, while other states have a de minimis amount that's acceptable, say under $25. Usually specific values are considered as part of ethics, and these values are honesty, fairness, and integrity. So we have a few definitions here, slides with definitions, and the first definition is a definition of business ethics. Business ethics is the study of appropriate business policies and practices regarding potentially controversial subjects, and they include corporate governance, insider trading, bribery, discrimination, corporate social responsibility, and fiduciary responsibilities. The law often guides business ethics, but at all other times, business ethics provide a basic guideline and businesses can choose to follow these codes to gain public approval. Ethical lapses at businesses are a significant reputational risk. Thinking back, we've all heard of Enron, WorldCom, and Arthur Andersen. I actually worked at Arthur Andersen, and really what brought them down was reputational risk. They were no longer able to work on SEC clients, and other clients kind of saw that as a reputational risk and didn't hire Anderson to do anything for them either, which really then just brought the firm down. So reputational risk is a significant risk, and business ethics really plays into that significantly. Some of the more current examples that we've seen recently are the Boeing 737 MAX 8 issues with allegations that management knew there was a problem with that. The Volkswagen emission scandal, where management falsified records to show better emission results than actual. And the issues at Purdue Pharma with OxyContin and their potential knowledge of its addictive tendencies when they continued to push the drug. And then another example is PGE and their electrical wires that have started some fires, and then they shut down so that they wouldn't start fires. So those are all good current examples of business ethics at play in the workplace. We have a definition from Wikipedia of regulatory ethics. Regulatory ethics is a body of law and practical political philosophy that governs the conduct of civil servants and the members of regulatory agencies. It addresses issues such as bribery and the relationship of civil servants with businesses in the industries they regulate, as well as concerns about transparency, freedom of information and sunshine laws, and conflict of interest rules. In a way, regulators may be held to a higher standard than others, since they're a group who is assessing the ethics of others. Eric, I know you're going to be talking about public records, and you were a former regulator. Do you have anything to add at this point in time regarding kind of your thoughts on regulatory ethics?
I'm going to get into that here on one of our next slides, but these are the code of ethics that the states generally have, or agencies have, and we'll talk a little bit about those codes and the penalties that are involved.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. So ethical leadership. Ethical leadership is the moral example set by leaders and has a major impact on the behavior of their subordinates, both good and bad, ethical and unethical. Despite their career success, leaders may be particularly vulnerable to ethical lapses. In performing the corporate governance review on financial examinations, we're making an assessment of the tone from the top at the insurer. The tone from the top is very critical to the overall ethical compass of an organization. If upper-level management has high ethical standards, it's more likely that the rest of the organization will as well. The ethical compass of an organization plays a significant role in the overall corporate governance of the company. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Eric, who will discuss the formation of a code of ethics.
Thanks, Jan. Jan just discussed what we mean by ethics, and she defined regulatory ethics. As you guys are probably aware, many states have ethics requirements in their statutes, and sometimes at the agency level. In Florida, the ethics code is in Chapter 112 of the Florida statutes, the Code of Ethics for Public Officers and Employees. The code is applicable to public officers, employees, lobbyists, and others in state and local government. Chapter 112 is the code I actually used as a prosecutor for the state of Florida. The legislative intent memorialized in the code spells out the goals of the code and stresses that public employees and officials must be independent and impartial, and that public positions must not be used for private gain. The code is designed to protect the public. On the other hand, the legislature recognized that the code's requirements could keep qualified individuals from serving in the government. You could make an ethics code so restrictive that no one could work for the government. Therefore, the lawmakers try to draft the rules so it protects the public, but individuals are not excluded from serving. Definitely a balancing act. If you don't know if you're covered by a regulatory code, do some research on the internet. Reach out to your state clients. Employees of state agencies are bound by these codes. If the code is applicable, you could potentially be sanctioned for violations of the code. Even if you're not bound, it's good to know the rules that your state counterparts are working under. You obviously have to know the rules of the game. The rules are usually broken down into sections based on various prohibited conduct, and we're going to look at a few of these standard provisions in the next couple of slides. I would like to point out that there are resources out there to help you navigate these ethics issues. A lot of states have published ethics opinions, frequently asked questions, and scenarios are available online that you can review. They also have case results where someone was actually prosecuted. You can see what they did in terms of a violation and what happened as a result. All these help you give context and help you understand the requirements in real-world situations. One I look at in my daily life is the Florida Bar prints ethics case summaries in the Bar newspaper. It really helps to see the scenarios spelled out. You probably won't believe all the different ways folks can get themselves into ethics troubles. But generally, you're going to see typical provisions in virtually any ethics code, and we'll run through a few of these. The first one is gifts. Jan mentioned gift provisions. You generally can't accept a gift based upon any understanding that your actions would be influenced. Under the Florida definition, a gift means anything accepted by a person, whether directly or indirectly, for which equal or greater consideration is not given within 90 days of receipt of the gift. In other words, if you didn't pay for it, it's a gift. And this applies to gifts to spouses and children also. Code allows gifts, the Florida Code allows gifts as long as there's no indication it was intended to influence actions. But this is a fact question and is often up for debate. There are usually, however, reporting requirements for gifts over a certain amount. So in Florida, you can accept a gift as long as it was not intended to influence your actions. With a code provision like this, it leaves a lot of room for questionable behavior. To combat that, I've seen agencies that remove all judgment and just prohibit accepting any gift. And that's what happened at the agency I worked at in Florida. They just said zero tolerance. It took all the judgment out of the equation and makes the decision easy. But it leads to situations you've probably seen when you go to a conference and there's folks in the back getting the quote free coffee in the back, and they're actually leaving dollar bills there. You know, they're trying not to get into trouble. The next two seem obvious. You can't do business with the agency you work for, and you can't accept improper compensation. Obviously, in these cases, the benefits flow to the individual at the expense of the agency. While that seems obvious, I'm just looking at the internet this morning, and there's a county in Florida spent $182,000 on beer koozies, which sounds crazy enough. But the county leaders didn't know that at the time they were actually purchasing those koozies from a county employee that had a side business. It turns out they spent almost $420,000 on various items with that company. That is probably not going to turn out very well for that county official. Here are a few more typical provisions. Corrupt use of public position. This is generally a catch-all. There's no way to write a rule that can possibly contemplate all the imaginative ways that people can come up with to cheat for personal gain at the expense of the agency. So with this provision, if all else fails, this provision will cover it. Conflicts of interest, another obvious one. You generally cannot have a conflict of interest. The county employee we just talked about had a personal interest in her private business that conflicted with her duty to the county. We're going to talk more about conflicts of interest later in the presentation. Post-employment restrictions, these are usually in state codes. These are often known as revolving door policies. These rules prohibit folks from working for an agency one day and then representing a company or a person in front of that agency the next day. And this happens all the time with lawyers. They get hired away from the state and want to use their expertise. Sometimes these restrictions are limited to specific time periods. For example, in Florida, it's 2 years. And sometimes they're limited to specific matters. Before we get to the last bullet, I want to discuss penalties real quick, just to give you an idea of the penalties available for violations of the state ethics code. I went and pulled the penalties from the Florida code, and the potential penalties for violating the code are 1, dismissal from employment, suspension from employment for not more than 90 days without pay, demotion, reduction in salary level, forfeiture of no more than 1/3 salary per month for no more than 12 months, a civil penalty not to exceed $10,000, restitution, or public censure and reprimand. And you'll notice in all these penalties there's no jail time. Penalties can be severe, but these are ethics violations and not crimes. So this is civil and not criminal. But when we get to this last bullet here, we're talking about actual crimes, bribery and embezzlement. Now we're potentially talking about the state police and the FBI getting involved. So there can be jail or prison time in addition to fines. So far we've been talking about the state code of ethics. However, you could also be subject to other codes. So in your daily life, look at the organizations you belong to. We've listed a couple on the slide, bar ethics codes, CPA codes. We're going to talk a little more later about the SOPHI, the proposed SOPHI code. IRIS or IAIR is another one. But there's others out there. So generally, when you join one of these organizations, you agree to be bound by their code of ethics. And for organizations like the bar, violations of the code could impact your ability to work. If you're disbarred, you can't practice. I also mentioned above that agencies within the state can have their own codes. They can mirror the state code or they can be stricter. The gift provisions we discussed earlier are a good example. The state may allow you to accept a gift while your agency may prohibit all gifts. You need to do your research and know the applicable rules. Now we're going to get into some basic ethics theory, and this is the kind of stuff that academics spend a lot of time on. Ethical standards and issue analysis are generally based on a mixture of different philosophies, including the 4 we listed on this slide. The first one, the utilitarian approach, this is kind of like the first tenet in medicine. The focus of this approach is do no harm. The goal is to produce the greatest good and the least amount of harm. This approach looks at consequences. What intended behavior will produce the greatest benefit and the least amount of harm or unintended consequences? Like I mentioned earlier, for example, we don't want standards so strict that no one can serve in government. The next one, the fairness or justice approach. This approach is based on the belief that all people should be treated equally or fairly based on a defensible standard. It asks, does an action treat everyone in the same way, or does it show favoritism and discrimination? Favoritism gives benefits to some people without a justifiable reason for singling them out, and discrimination imposes burdens on people who are no different from those on whom the burdens are not imposed. Both favoritism and discrimination are obviously wrong and should be avoided. However, with this approach, someone has to determine what fair is, and that's where the problems arise. Common good approach. With this approach, decisions are made based on improving the welfare of everyone, the community at large. Examples are police and fire departments, public education, recreation, and healthcare policy. These are often created based on the common good approach. And this approach emphasizes community over the individual. And finally, the virtue approach. The virtue approach answers the question, what kind of person will I become if I do this? It looks at what behaviors bring out the highest potential in people. These would include virtues such as truth and honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, integrity, fairness, self-control, etc. When you're reviewing an ethics code, you'll probably be able to spot all these different aspects in each of the codes. So there are several goals that all ethics policies generally try to achieve. This is true for state codes and codes at companies. The code will set out the organization's core values and expectations in general terms. This is the big picture: honesty, respect, transparency, etc. The virtues we just discussed. This part of the code provides guidance to help employees do the right thing, even in instances that are either unclear or not covered by the written rules. The code should confirm the organization's commitment to ethics. This is the tone from the top. This and requires mandatory compliance. Ethics needs to be part of the organization's general culture. When this is not true, you get the large scandals that you read about in the newspaper. An example I always think of is the Wells Fargo example. The code needs to describe a process to report potential violations. There has to be a way to report violations that will encourage employees and others to speak up. Code is merely aspirational if there's no enforcement. One of the weaknesses in the Florida Code is that it requires sworn complaints. You can't report anonymously, and this discourages people from reporting suspected violations. It was a constant complaint about the Florida Ethics Code. It never got the big fish because everybody was afraid to report. The code should describe the monitoring process. How will the organization determine if there's compliance beyond coworker reports? Again, there has to be enforcement. The code should identify ethical issues. This helps the people that are subject to the code to comply. You need to know what the danger areas are. Finally, the code should identify supporting policies and documents. And these are generally reference materials to help people make ethical decisions, like the frequently asked questions and opinions that we talked about. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Jan to get more specific and get into the proposed SOPHI code. Jan?
Thanks, Eric. SOPHI's executive committee has been working over the last year or so on a new code of conduct. The current code of conduct was developed at the inception of SOPHI in the 70s, and generally organizations refresh their code of conduct or code of ethics, as they may call it, periodically, and SOPHI determined that it was time for a refresh of the code. So the new proposed code of conduct was developed to be more relevant to current workplace situations that are occurring today versus back in the 70s. And SOPHI's executive committee developed and approved the revised code of conduct. And the next step is that it will be put forth for approval by the SOPHI board in the spring and SOPHI membership at the 2020 CDS. So over the next few slides here, I'll give you a preview of the new code of conduct and talk a little bit more about specific portions of that and what they really mean to us all as members of SOPHI and AFEs and CFEs. I'm going to read about the code of conduct here, and then we'll talk a little bit more in terms of what some of these principles mean to you. Society of Financial Examiners membership is voluntary. By accepting membership, members assume the obligations of adhering to the Code of Ethical Conduct in accordance with the SOPHI restated bylaws. SOPHI has adopted this Code of Ethical Conduct to provide guidance to all members in the performance of their professional responsibilities. SOPHI members must adhere to the following 5 principles at all times during their membership. Now I'll read the first 2 principles and we'll talk about them. The first principle is integrity. members at all times must demonstrate the qualities of honesty and trustworthiness. With the principle of integrity, members need to be beyond reproach in terms of their honesty and trustworthiness with each other, with their employers, with their colleagues, and with industry. Now I'll read the term principle of objectivity. Objectivity. Members must maintain objectivity and be free of conflicts of interest in discharging their professional responsibilities. Members must not allow bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override their personal or business judgments. In terms of objectivity, members need to act independently and steer clear of any conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean about that later on. Members must not allow bias or undue influence, which we'll talk about later as well, from others to override their professional judgment. In a few slides more, we'll talk about some of these issues, bias, conflicts of interest, and undue influence, and how they may cause ethical dilemmas. The next three principles are professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. I'm going to read to you about professional competence and due care. Members must maintain professional knowledge and skills based on the current developments in the practice, legislation, and techniques. Members are responsible for performing their job duties to the best of their ability, using due diligence and in accordance with applicable professional standards. The professional competence and due care principle discusses keeping current on your skills and knowledge of industry issues, risks, events, and keeping current in regulation, changes in SSAPs, changes in financial reporting guidance, changes in the examiner's and analyst handbook, etc. Members are expected to keep current on these matters. Good ways I've found of keeping current are, first of all, getting your CRE credits. If you attend the SOPHI CDS or attend state trainings or contractor firm trainings or other trainings that are put out there, you will hopefully be able to learn more about current events, what's going on in the industry, things that are changing, and you'll be able to stay current on what you're doing for your job as an examiner or analyst. Other things that I do are following changes in regulation. If you work for a particular state, you can follow the changes in their regulations. Usually there's a legislative page that shows any changes or proposed changes. Following changes in SSAPs and financial reporting guidance. You can find that information on the NAIC website in terms of what's changing in the risk-focused surveillance working group, and the accounting practices and procedures working group, and the blanks working group. And then I also think it's a good idea to just perform an annual review of the examiner's and analyst handbook. Usually, at least on the examiner's handbook, they come out with changes to the handbook, but I really think it's good to just sit down and kind of reread the handbook and especially specific sections of the handbook just to make sure that you understand anything new that's in the handbook, or refresh yourself on something that maybe you don't use very often as well. There's also several really good daily and weekly news sources that come out, such as the NAIC Newswire. To get that, you just need to go to the NAIC website and request them to send it to you. SNL provides many daily briefings. You can go in and customize what you're looking for there. I do believe there's a subscription required for that, but I think regulators get that for free or maybe as part of another subscription that they have. And you can customize SNL to give you specific information on certain industries or even certain companies. You can set an alert anytime there's a news article that comes out on that company, it will send you information. Other good sources are National Underwriter, AHIP, RIMS. industry associations are always good for providing current and relevant information on specific industries and the risks within those industries. So, you could probably have, I have so many news sources, sometimes I kind of think, okay, I just don't even have time to keep up with all these. You could spend all day just reading news information, but there's a lot of information out there, and especially if you get onto an exam or you're analyzing a company where you see a risk and you don't know a lot about it, use the internet. Google's a wonderful search tool, and you can oftentimes find a ton of information just even on the internet to learn more about certain risks or certain issues that the companies are facing. So moving on to confidentiality, I'll read the definition of the principle and then we'll talk about that a little bit more. Confidentiality. Members must maintain the privacy and confidentiality of information acquired as a result of professional and business relationships, and therefore not disclose any such information unless disclosure is legally permitted, nor use the information for personal advantage of the member or third parties. And later on in the slides, we'll talk about some examples of confidentiality breaches that have been problematic and areas not to go in terms of ethics issues. So to talk about confidentiality, I believe it's a very, very important principle and really is kind of an underpinning for establishing trust in all of your relationships. When we perform exams and analysis, we are privy to a lot of information that the companies consider to be highly confidential. And it's really our duty to make sure that we do keep that information confidential. We're also often exposed to information that's protected under HIPAA or other privacy laws, and we need to be very diligent to maintain the confidentiality of that information. Usually what I do is go by the principle of requesting only exactly what I need to use. So if I'm making a data request, I only request certain fields, and usually you don't need the person's name, so try not to request that, especially if I'm getting a copy of something, a hard copy or an electronic copy. I ask for the company to black out any personal information before they give me that work paper, just so that I don't have that information from the start and I don't have to worry about it. The other thing that I do, especially if I'm on site with the company, a lot of times you're on site, they give you a lot of paper information. I just store that information in a locked drawer at the company. I always keep it there. And when we're done with the exam, I turn all the information back to the company and I say, here, this is yours. You, please do something with this so that it gets properly disposed of. The final principle in SOPHI's new code of ethics is professional behavior. So I'm going to read the definition of professional behavior, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Professional behavior. Members must comply with relevant laws and regulations to avoid any action that discredits themselves or the Society of Financial Examiners. Members must not use or attempt to use their official position to obtain improper privileges or exemptions for themselves or others. So in addition to not using their official position to obtain improper privileges or exemptions, we need to also make sure that we are complying with relevant laws and regulations, and we're also putting forth our best professional behavior as a representative of the state. I'm sure everyone probably has a story or two to tell about examiners who were asked not to come back to a company because of poor professional behavior. Some examples I have are one example of an examiner who came to a company and she would wander around. It was a big company, several floors in a big office building. She would wander around to all the different floors, even though she wasn't working with any of the people on the floors, and visit the potlucks they were having, take candy out of their candy dishes, etc. Even went to the cafeteria one day and asked for an empty mayonnaise jar that she was going to use for something, I don't know what. But she obviously was not exhibiting professional behavior and was talked to and asked not to come back to that company again. I also have another example of someone who had a very unprofessional shouting match with the company contact and also was asked not to come back to that company again. And I have some other examples too that we'll discuss in later examples. I think nobody wants to be known as one of those examiners, and nobody wants to have one of those examiners on their staff or have to deal with issues of explaining or defending any type of behavior like that. So that's why professional behavior is so very important. So SOPHI's Code of Conduct is rounded out by stating that members must at all times adhere to the SOPHI oath regarding tests and examinations. It says members at all times must adhere to the SOPHI oath regarding tests and examinations incorporated by reference into this code. Actions for disciplinary sanction for violations of this code of ethics may be brought before the board or only by a member of the Professional Standards Committee. And we'll talk a little bit more about SOPHI examinations, the examiner's oath, and the proctor oath later. And we'll talk about the Professional Standards Committee coming up next here as well, and how that works. So wanted to go into a little bit more detail on each of the principles in the SOPHI Code of Professional Conduct. First one is integrity. Members at all times must demonstrate the qualities of honesty and trustworthiness. It's very important that as examiners and analysts, we gain the trust of the company. I think trust is a very important element in any relationship, but it's especially important in a relationship with the company. Due to the highly confidential nature of most of the company has, both from a regulated perspective and from a competitive standpoint, their initial reaction is to prevent the examiner or analyst from getting any information or for getting any information possible. Examiners and analysts can gain trust of the company contact by acting with integrity and exhibiting confidentiality. And then the contact might be more willing to share information with them. Additionally, when performing testing and asking about potential findings, company personnel are often more open to admit errors, etc., if they feel they can trust the examiner. So I think it's so important to gain trust and have integrity, and to have your coworkers and people at the company to see you as a person of high integrity, that this is the first principle in SOPHI's Code of Conduct, and I think as the first principle, we need to all keep it on our minds at all times. Moving on to the next principle of objectivity. Members must maintain objectivity and be free of conflicts of interest in discharging their professional responsibilities. Members must not allow bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override their professional or business judgments. And I pulled a few definitions from the dictionary just to provide kind of more color around some of these things, because initially I kind of thought bias, what really is that? How does that fit in? So define all three: conflicts of interest, a conflict between the private interest and the official responsibilities of a person in a position of trust. So really, someone has their own private interests, and they're trying to push those interests and have influence over someone because of that. Bias, a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment, and undue influence, improper influence that deprives a person of freedom of choice or substitutes another's choice or desire for the person's own. So I have a few examples here of conflict of interest and bias and undue influence. So conflict of interest, perhaps you have another client relationship with the company under exam. So maybe it's a contractor that's doing an exam of the company, but they're also consulting with the company to help them on their MAR compliance. That would definitely be a conflict of interest because they would be looking at their own work that they did in the MAR compliance. So that's a pretty clear-cut conflict of interest. Second example, you have a close family member or friend who's a key employee of the company. So if you're examining or analyzing the company and your close friend or family member works there or is in a position in charge, maybe you would tend to cut them a little bit more slack because you're friends with them, and obviously that's a conflict of interest. Third example that I have is previous employment at the company, and I think that may or may not present a conflict of interest depending on what your role was in the company and how far in the past that you worked there. If your role was an actuary at the company and now you work for a firm or work for the state and you're doing an exam of the company and you just came into that new role, you could be examining the work that you did, and that would be a conflict of interest. If it was, maybe several years down the road from there, it might not be a conflict of interest, and it might actually be very helpful because you would have knowledge of the company and how they do their work. So that would be more of a kind of a gray area that you need to think about and perhaps discuss with people in charge, such as the chief examiner or chief analyst. So those are some good examples that I was thinking of in terms of conflict of interest. In terms of bias, I had a couple examples that I could think of here. One was, although the company's product is legal and it's a valid product, you think the company's product is a ripoff and it takes advantage of people. And I had that situation once with one of the examiners where they thought that credit insurance was kind of a ripoff and that people were getting taken advantage of it when they buy a refrigerator or something, and someone tries to push this credit life or credit disability insurance onto them, and so that person, I think, was trying to be more stringent and come up with issues that really weren't issues because they had a bias against the type of product that the company sold. Another example of bias is the company is owned by a company domiciled out of the United States, and you have a bias against foreign ownership of U.S. insurers. So maybe you're more stringent on them because of that bias. And the third I came up with, third example, is the company is owned by a person of an identifiable group. Maybe it's a woman, minority, person of a certain political affiliation, etc. And you feel there should be more insurers owned by people of that group. So maybe you cut them a little bit of slack in their regulation. So those are all examples that I could come up with where bias could potentially come into play of your objectivity. Regarding undue influence, came up with a few different examples there too. Maybe there's a company CEO that has a really prominent standing within the community or within the insurance community, or maybe carries a lot of weight in terms of lobbying to your legislature. Maybe you have undue influence from that CEO just because of their standing in the community or affiliations with the legislature, etc. The second example that I came up with is a CEO or someone else in management that makes you feel like they know much more than you do about the subject and that you must just be stupid not to understand it. I think there, it's pretty obvious. We just keep on asking questions until we do understand it, and maybe also try to influence that person as to why their understanding of the situation doesn't agree with statutes or with financial reporting or statutory accounting or whatever it may be. The third example I have of undue influence is perhaps the EIC tells you that even though you have a significant finding, they don't think it should be reported. And maybe they don't give you even a very good reason for it, but they just say, we don't need to worry about that. Perhaps the EIC is presenting undue influence on you. Not sure why, maybe they have some bias, who knows. But in that situation, you should probably go above the EIC and maybe talk to the assistant chief or the chief examiner, or if it's on the analyst side, the chief analyst, and just say, hey, I think I have this issue. The EIC doesn't see it my way. What do you think? Just to make sure that there's no undue influence going on there. So moving on to professional competence and due care. Members must maintain professional knowledge and skill based upon the current developments in practice, legislation, and techniques. Members are responsible for performing their job duties to the best of their ability, using due diligence and in accordance with applicable professional standards. That includes maintaining professional knowledge and skill and performing job duties to the best of your ability. Talking a little bit about maintaining professional knowledge and skill, I think it's really important, and obviously SOPHI does too, requiring continuing regulatory education and requiring it in certain areas such as the Examiner Analyst Handbook requirement and the ethics requirement. So it is very important that you do stay current by taking relevant continuing professional education. Actually being present in that education and paying attention to it is very important. So, we don't want you texting, sleeping, surfing, etc. I know on webinars it's easy to multitask, and that's why I'm kind of reading some of these slides so that if people are multitasking, they get the whole message here. But really, in the training, especially the technical training on new areas, we really do need to pay attention and limit our distractions so that we really do learn what we need to do to stay abreast of our position. Talked a little bit about it before, but continuously improving your knowledge by daily reading of news sources, etc., is important to do. And then not being afraid to try new things or take on a challenge. I think especially when risk focus was rolled out, and I know for examiners that was a while ago, but it's still a relatively new thing for analysts. I think people were a little bit afraid of it, or wanted to go back to the SRA approach and, well, this is how I've always done it and it works, and I don't know why they're making me look at these risks, and I don't understand prospective risks, so I'm afraid to do it. Challenge yourself. Don't be afraid. Work with a mentor to guide you. Find someone who can help you with it. I think, embrace risk-focused analysis and exams, and don't be stuck in your ways, and that will help you perform your job duties really to the best of your ability. The other thing that applies here is just taking care to make sure that you do your best work. I know, kind of doing the work day in and day out, it kind of gets sometimes to a point where you're just like, oh, geez, I just want to get this done. But make sure that every day you are doing your best work. I think that's very important. Go back and perform a self-review of your work. Ask for help if you don't understand something or can't think of how to describe it. And really kind of, even if you're a state employee or a contractor, consider yourself to be a consultant to the regulator and to the company, in terms of how the company can improve its compliance and solvency. So really kind of go one step beyond and add some value to your work, and that might make it feel more rewarding as well. So now I wanted to talk about SOPHI's Professional Standards Committee. If there's a breach of SOPHI's Code of Conduct, it should be reported to the Professional Standards Committee. The charges must be made in writing, but the fact that the charges have been presented will remain confidential. In general, I think that SOPHI's membership is made up of highly ethical individuals, and for as long as I've been on SOPHI's board, I don't recall any matters being brought up to the SOPHI's Professional Standards Committee. So it's kind of a lonely committee, but it is there to address issues where ethics have been breached and where someone needs to be kind of brought up to that committee. And there are sanctions, and I think we'll get into those on the next page here. Yes, if something is brought up to the Professional Standards Committee, they'll review the facts and circumstances, investigate the case, and vote to determine what, if any, sanctions should be imposed. SOPHI can have very stringent sanctions, such as taking away someone's designation if they determine it's warranted based upon this situation. So it is very important, and the people on the Professional Standards Committee have a very important job and need to make sure that they're making the right decisions, because it can have a significant impact on somebody if their designation is taken away. So one other thing that SOPHI has, and will be coming out with likely very soon, before the end of the year maybe, is a new proctor oath for the SOPHI examinations. SOPHI's Code of Conduct states that members at all times must adhere to the Society of Financial Examiners oath regarding tests and examinations incorporated by reference into this code. It's also very important for proctors of SOPHI tests to adhere to the proctor oath. As with the Code of Conduct, SOPHI is also revising its proctor oath, and it's going to be better aligned with the changing times. Going from paper tests, which was how I took the SOPHI exams, to computerized tests, as well as today's connected society, have opened up many opportunities for cheating on SOPHI tests, unfortunately. And because of this, proctors need to be more diligent to ensure that nobody is cheating on the SOPHI test. The new proctor oath states the following: as a proctor for the examination, I certify the following. I'm a certified financial examiner in good standing with the Society of Financial Examiners, or I've been duly authorized in writing to administer this examination by SOPHI. So most of the people who do proctor exams are CFEs. However, there are a few proctors that might be administrative personnel, et cetera, that administer the SOPHI exam, and those are special situations that have been pre-approved by SOPHI. I will be present during the entire course of the test to help maintain the integrity of the testing environment. We'll talk about that a little bit more later and why that's so important. I will be actively paying attention to the actions taken by the candidate, including from time to time actively observing and or walking by the candidate to verify they're only on the test.com site and they are not using other online or physical copy sources for assistance during the test. And we'll talk about that as well later on. I have verified that the candidate did not bring any notes or electronic devices, including a smartphone or watch, into the testing area other than a non-phone/watch-based standard calculator. So really, the only electronics that a candidate is able to have is just a very simple calculator along with them for the test. All notes taken by the candidate during the examination will be collected from the candidate after the examination and properly disposed of or shredded. So any paper notes that the candidate takes, those go back to the proctor and they shred those notes. And in order to maintain the reputation of the designation, I will be diligent to prevent and, if necessary, report any form of cheating during the test. So this is a new proctor oath that we're going to be rolling out. It's very important, talking about being present, it's very important for the proctor to be present for the entire test and actively paying attention to the candidate to ensure they're not cheating, because now that we have computers and text and whatever, it would be very easy for a candidate to cheat on the test. It's really a best practice for the test taker to take the test on what we call an independent computer, and that's a computer that has no access to the internet or any programs on it. A lot of times these types of computers are maybe in a training room at the state, but those are really kind of the best practice that we have in terms of test taking environment. We know that that's not always practical. So when the test taker is taking the test on their own computer and maybe has additional resources and access to the internet, etc., the proctor has to be extra diligent to make sure that the person is not cheating on the test. It's also the responsibility of the proctor to report any form of cheating. And I think this might be very difficult because generally you're eager for the test taker to pass and you want them to pass, but it is very important to maintain the integrity of the designation, and so you do need to report if you do catch someone cheating. So hopefully people know that the proctors are going to be paying attention. Hopefully we have very ethical people taking the test anyway, and we don't need to worry about this, but I think it's something that we all do need to consider. So wanted to segue a little bit here and talk about why ethical behavior is so critical for examiners and analysts. Examiners and analysts are representatives of the state, so what they say and do is a reflection of the state. Even if you're a contractor and don't work directly for the state, the company still sees you as really being the state, and you're a reflection on them. And then I think too, people at the company probably think, how can a regulator hold us to certain ethical standards if they don't hold themselves to those standards? So to sum things up, ethical behavior is critical for examiners and analysts because they're representatives of the state, and what they say and do is a reflection on the state. Companies will definitely question how the state can hold a company to those standards if they're not ethical themselves. So what if an ethical issue does arise? Before you act, you need to determine a few things. What are the facts? Do you understand the facts? Are you clear on what those are? Is the company in agreement or the other person in agreement as to what the facts were? Who was involved in the incident and who was affected? Was anyone affected? And if nobody was affected, does that mean it's an ethical lapse or not? I think it really depends on the situation, probably. What were the underlying causes? Did something happen to cause it? What was that? Is it something that's a good excuse, maybe? What principles or values should be upheld or should have been upheld? It's good to know that. What is the best and worst case scenario in the situation? And what are possible solutions to an ethical issue that maybe has arisen? What are the pros and cons associated with it? And then what's your decision? And I think it's really good to kind of talk some of these issues out with people too, with at least one other person, maybe your EIC, your assistant chief examiner, to really determine, was there a significant issue? So, I think because challenging someone's ethics is, a very highly sensitive area, you need to make sure that you understand all the facts before jumping to conclusions and accusing someone of doing something improper. So here's a few common excuses of why people claim that ethical breaches have occurred. I don't think they're sufficient excuses, but my boss told me to. We have an example of that later on. I'll lose my job if I don't. Everyone does it. It's expected. I have to do it to get ahead. the organization won't notice, and my customers won't expect it. I don't think these are any of these are really very sufficient. Earlier in my career, before I came into the insurance industry, I investigated bank fraud, and some of these were common excuses for people committing fraud as well as ethical lapses. And currently I work with a lot of troubled companies, and it's really interesting and, I don't know, sometimes amusing in a sad way, that these excuses seem to kind of come out of the woodwork in a troubled company as well. Sometimes every other week there's something new that comes out of the woodwork, and you wonder, what were these people thinking that we're doing this and that we're making these ethical lapses? So in the next several slides, what we're going to do is go through some examples of behaviors that are easy for people to fall into and make an ethical lapse. And Eric is going to start by discussing groupthink. So Eric, here you go.
Thanks, Jan. Like Jan said, these are basically just human behavior concepts you can think about when you're analyzing ethics issues. We're all in danger of falling into these traps. And all these excuses that Jan just went through, you can probably take these next couple of concepts and explain these excuses. It's just human nature. The trick is recognizing what's happening and taking the appropriate action. The first concept is groupthink, and this occurs based on either the urge to conform or the discouragement of dissent. People often find it hard to think and act independently in group situations. We just don't like to stick out or appear dumb. This happens when folks are more interested in staying in the group than doing the right thing. They don't want to rock the boat. The phrase I always think about is go along to get along. And that can lead to the illusion of agreement within the group and can lead to smart individuals making bad decisions in a group. I think this is probably a factor in most large-scale ethics violations that you read about. In retrospect, it's easier to wonder, what on earth were they thinking? You know someone in the group had to be smart enough to know that their actions were wrong and that it was not going to end well, but everyone kept following the herd. In general, it takes a strong ethical leader to encourage openness and dissent in the group, but that's what makes for a stronger group and better decisions. The next one is loss aversion, and Jan's going to talk about that.
Thanks, Eric. We all hate losses about twice as much as we enjoy gains, meaning that we're more likely to act unethically to avoid a loss than secure a gain. This phenomenon is known as loss aversion. We tend to see this behavior occur very frequently in troubled companies. It seems that the management of the troubled company is just trying to make it appear that they're solvent until the next quarter, when undoubtedly their earnings will improve or their losses will decrease. This never seems to work out, though, and eventually they're caught. We'll discuss more examples of financial manipulation that are associated with loss aversion later on in the presentation. We have a lot of really good examples from what we've seen at some of the troubled companies that we've worked on. So Eric will now talk about the slippery slope of incrementalism.
All right, incrementalism, which everybody knows as the slippery slope, it describes how we unconsciously lower our ethical standards over time through small changes in behavior. When people become accustomed to wrongdoing in their environment, it becomes the accepted, the status quo. It can happen when people cut small corners that become bigger over time. Almost every instance of accounting fraud begins with people manipulating small numbers that grow larger and larger. The unethical behavior may start small and infrequent, but it gets easier each time and can lead to bigger violations. I found a quote on the internet that sums it up pretty nicely. Incrementalism is how we slide into participation by imperceptible degrees so that there is never the sense of a frontier being crossed. Next up, rationalization.
Okay. So rationalizations are invented explanations that hide or deny true motivations, causes, or actions. They're the excuses people give themselves for not living up to their own ethical standards. And rationalizations are many of the excuses that we talked about earlier, like my boss made me do it, etc. Or everyone's doing it. When I was investigating fraud, there were some people who rationalized that they were owed that money. Maybe they, didn't make very much and they thought they should be making more, or that they were just borrowing money temporarily to get them through a rough spot, and then they would pay it back. People with rationalizations often have good intentions of righting the ship, but usually the intentions are not well thought out, and the ship rarely gets righted. I'll turn it back over to Eric to discuss self-serving bias.
Thanks. This is the last concept we're going to talk about. Self-serving bias is exactly what it sounds like. We all look for evidence that advances our own self-interest. Studies show we can easily see the self-serving bias in others, but we have difficulty seeing it in ourselves. For example, doctors tend to believe that they're immune from the influence of gifts from pharmaceutical companies. Studies show that those gifts have a significant effect on what medications the doctors prescribe. One study found that 64% of doctors believe that the freebies they received from pharmaceutical companies influenced other doctors, but only 16% of doctors thought it affected their own actions. It's really hard to see bias in ourselves. It can cause even the most well-intentioned of us to completely overlook our own potentially bad actions. Now we're going to talk about dealing with unethical people. And we'll talk about what to consider if you have the unfortunate experience of having to do this. Hopefully this will be a rare occurrence for you. Dealing with unethical people can be extremely difficult, especially if that person is a boss or a coworker. If you're dealing with a potential unethical situation and may have to report a violation, the first thing to do is go to the applicable code of ethics for information on the provisions and reporting requirements. Get prepared. You want to make sure you've got your facts straight and are not assuming or guessing. Facts and context matter in these situations. You want to include as much documentation as possible if you may have to report a situation. You want to make sure you've got firsthand knowledge. Don't base your claims or accusations on hearsay. Even if the source is someone you trust, see if you can substantiate that person's claim or tell that source to report the violation. Confirm the facts with others if possible. And I suggest, Jan mentioned it earlier, talk to a mentor, seek advice, talk to the examiner in charge. Like she said, these are very serious matters. And also keep in mind that depending on the code, a failure to report could also be a violation. And most of the tips on this slide are really just good advice for dealing with folks in your business life. Obviously, you want to be ethical in your day-to-day life. It just makes your life easier. It's always easier to just do the right thing. Lead by example. That may encourage other folks to follow your lead and behave ethically themselves. Make sure that you admit mistakes. We all make mistakes, but remember, it's always the cover-up that gets folks in trouble. Try and find a common ground with your coworkers, customers, and vendors. As you develop a rapport and common ground, you might be able to influence their decisions and choices to be more ethical. Now Jan is going to move to the next slide and discuss ethical issues that could impact examiners and analysts.
All right. So, a lot of times we have these ethics trainings, and we never really talk about ethical issues that could impact examiners and analysts. We talk about, things that are going on at companies, et cetera. So wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about ethical issues that could impact examiners and analysts. And I think, these are pretty, probably few and far between, but in my time doing exams, I've kind of seen it all in terms of some of this. So first one is billing time for non-work activities. And, while You know, someone is, if they're a contractor, obviously that's, you know, they bill all their time. I know some state employees, you know, maybe they bill their time, maybe they don't bill their time, maybe the company isn't even charged for the exam, but I think somehow even out of premium taxes, the company ends up paying for the exam. So if there's an examiner on site and they're doing something that's kind of an ethical issue or lapse, such as billing time for non-work activities, that could be problematic. And I have an example of one company, and this is years ago when I first started doing regulatory exams, but there was a zone examiner who would, it's funny, the zone examiners, they always used to ask for their own office. They had to have their own office. And he would go into his office every day after lunch and take a nap. And it was a long nap, and you know, he didn't take time out of the time that he billed to the company to do that. Other example, there was another examiner, again, this is many years ago, who had their own office and would go into the office every day with a big newspaper and spend several hours some days reading that big newspaper. I think, you know, in both of those situations, I know that the guy who was sleeping, zone examiner, got banned from ever doing exams in the state again. And I think the newspaper reader probably was kind of similarly, you know, don't come back. I think these days we have a little bit different environment, and, you know, maybe people don't think about things like that, but a lot of times people are working from home on an exam, and, you know, what they're doing, maybe nobody else notices, but still, you know, you should only bill for the time that you actually work. So, you know, texting, reading the newspaper, a book, something on the web, surfing the web, those are all non-work activities, and you really shouldn't be doing them while you're at work, or if you do, certainly not, you know, billing the time for that. I think excessive personal phone calls would kind of come into that as well. Watching Oprah, who knows what, those are all kind of don'ts in terms of ethics, in terms of what you could do at work or while you're working at home. Another issue we talked about a little bit before, but we've heard rumors, and at this point in time, it's just rumors of people cheating on SOPHI tests. I don't want to give any examples of how someone could cheat on a SOPHI test because I don't want to give any ideas, but I think in the connected world that we have, there's a lot of ways to cheat on a test without really being noticed. And almost worse than cheating, although really an ethical quandary, is allowing someone to cheat or having knowledge of cheating but not reporting it. I think, you know, we all want to pass the SOPHI exams to get our designation, and we've been studying so hard for them, and we all want our coworkers and subordinates to pass them, and I think, you know, in some states there's, you know, bonuses and salaries and titles that go along with that, but is it really worth passing if you have to cheat to do it, or if you have to allow someone to cheat to do it? And really, you know, if anyone ever found out about it, you could potentially lose your designation. So I just think, you know, this is something, again, a don't, something that you don't want to do. It's not worth doing this just to try to get ahead. So the next one is purposefully ignoring investigating a risk. So, you know, there could be several reasons why you don't investigate a risk. We're all being asked to do more in less time, and the work we're doing is becoming more and more technically challenging in certain ways, especially in testing the prospective risks. Ethical situations could arise where an examiner or analyst purposefully ignores a risk because they don't have time to look into it. They could potentially just delete the risk entirely and hope that nobody catches it, or maybe do kind of a half-baked attempt to fluff around what the real issue was for the risk itself. This isn't doing anyone any favors. First of all, you'll likely get a coaching note on it and have to complete the work anyway. And if it's not caught in a coaching note, it could come up in accreditation, which would maybe have some bad consequences. And worse yet, it could be an issue at the company that really needs regulatory attention, and by your lack of investigating it, the situation becomes worse. Another issue is purposefully ignoring a risk that could be the examiner or analyst doesn't have the expertise to understand how it should be investigated. Some of what we look at these days is very complicated, and if you don't understand it, it's okay to raise your hand and ask for help. Generally, the EIC would rather you ask for help than ignore the risk and have to go through a barrage of coaching notes at a later date. We've all been in situations where we really just don't want to fight with a whiny exam contact, and we just want to be done with the exam. You're not doing yourself any favors there either by ignoring the situation. Just complete your work, complete the investigation of the issue, and make sure you have all the facts straight and present the issue to the company. If you're getting nowhere, bring in the people higher up, the EIC, assistant chief, chief examiner, and up the chain until you get the action necessary from the company to complete the work. Purposefully ignoring investigating a risk is another one of those don'ts that you don't want to have to deal with in terms of an ethical lapse. And that would go back to the SOPHI Code of Conduct too in the carrying out of your job responsibilities. Performing fake work, or what I call fake work. Don't know a better terminology there, but marking up a test with tick marks and saying no exceptions without actually performing the testing, or signing off as reviewer on a work paper without actually reviewing it. I think these are other things that examiners could do if they're pressed for time, but you're not doing anyone any favors here either. There could be an issue at the company that you had missed by cutting these corners, and just as bad is the reviewer that doesn't perform a thorough and challenging review, because they could miss something too that maybe is a big issue that they're missing by cutting corners. Could also be missing a coaching opportunity with the person performing the work. They might not understand the issues well if they need to discuss them with the company, and could be caught in the accreditation review as well. So make sure you don't perform fake work, and all the work that you do is real, and if you're a reviewer, that you're performing a thorough and challenging review. So the next one is known reliance on work that doesn't address the work. And I tend to see this more often than I'd like to see it. And I don't know if it's examiners are in a hurry, they really don't understand the risk or how it should be evaluated, or maybe they're taking an ethical shortcut. But you really only should be relying on work that's relevant to the risk at hand and the control being tested. If the work isn't relevant or only partially relevant, you should just perform independent testing to fully address the risk and control. Trying to fit a square peg into a round hole when you really know or should know that the work doesn't address the risk, again, doesn't do anyone any favors, and really in the long run just causes additional work. So conflict of interest. We've talked a lot about conflict of interest in the past slides. Generally, conflicts arise in one of two ways. The professional accountant provides a professional service related to a particular matter for two or more clients whose interests with respect to the matter are in conflict. Examples would be providing services to both a vendor and a purchaser in relation to the same transaction. Representing two clients regarding the same matter who are in a legal dispute with each other. Providing a service to a client to acquire an audit client of the firm, where the firm has obtained confidential information during the course of the audit that may be relevant to the transaction. Advising two clients at the same time who are competing to acquire the same company, where the advice might be relevant to the parties' competitive positions. The interests of a professional accountant and the interests of a client are in conflict. Advising a client to invest in a business which the spouse of the accountant has a financial interest. Examples specific to examiners and analysis would include examining or performing analysis on a company where a family member or close friend is in a controlling position at the company. It could also potentially apply to examining or performing analysis on a company for which you were previously employed if you're examining your own work. So I think we've talked about that quite a bit, and we all know to stay free of conflicts of interest. Couple more things here in terms of issues for examiners and analysis. Appearance of favoritism, bowing to pressure, or taking a bribe. I think it's pretty straightforward. Everyone knows that taking a bribe is an ethical issue, but bowing to pressure might be a slippery slope. What if the company is a prominent company in the state and bringing up a finding, et cetera, would put the company in a bad position? It could be an ethical dilemma in terms of how to best handle that type of a situation. And I think in those circumstances, it's always good to talk to your EIC, assistant chief, chief examiner, or others within the department to make sure that you're accurately portraying the issues, but that you're being fair in the portrayal of the issues as well, because we can't provide favoritism just to a prominent company. And then the last ethical issue example that I came up with that could impact examiners and analysts is breach of confidentiality. And that consists of use of insider information or using information obtained on one exam for another purpose. Confidentiality is one of the very most important aspects of gaining a company's trust. And I was on an exam once where the company was very wary of sharing any type of information with the examiners. As we found out, what had happened to the company in the past was that they had a market conduct examination, and there were some market conduct examiners in there performing the exam who took confidential information that they had obtained in the exam and actually went to the plaintiffs of a class action lawsuit against the company and worked for them as an expert witness using the material that they had gathered in the market conduct exam to do that. Eric, do you have anything else regarding the use of insider information that you've kind of seen in what you've done, or do you just want to talk about public records?
We'll get to that. We have a slide on insider information, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's get going and talk public records.
All right.
A lot of y'all either work for a state agency or provide services to a state agency, and you might be subject to public records laws. Public records laws are very broad, and this can come as a surprise to those of y'all that are in private industry. It's important you understand the reach of public records laws in the state you're working in. In a litigious environment, the other side's always looking for an advantage. There are exceptions to the public records laws, but you have to understand what the exception is and make sure that it applies before you're going to depend on it. You can find the actual laws in the state statutes. And I suggest you talk to your agency contacts and consider talking to the agency attorney to figure out exactly what these laws are and how they work in the state you're working in. So I put up the Florida definition of a public record, which you can see is very broad. This language comes from Section 119 in the Florida statutes. And it starts with a laundry list of items, documents, papers, letters, maps, books, tapes, photographs, films, sound recordings, data processing software, or other material regardless of the physical form or characteristics or means of transmission. So basically everything. The next important part is the words made or received. At the end of the day, what this means is virtually everything that comes into the agency is a public record. It's extremely broad. We've put up a couple standard examples of public records here. Based on the definition, everything on this list can be a public record. Remember, the definition said regardless of physical form, characteristics, or means of transmission. That means it includes phone messages, texts, and emails. When this law was written, everybody wasn't carrying around an iPhone in their pocket, but they've gone to court and the judges have agreed that emails, texts, digital phone records are all public records. Like I said, in each of these instances, you might have created a public record. When you sent that text to the state examiner, that might be a public record. All your emails, those are probably public records. In each case, something was actually received by the agency. That means somebody can make a public records request and ask to see all that. So with that in mind, what should you keep in mind when you're emailing a public agency? First off, be very judicious with emails. It's just human nature, but people tend to get very casual with emails. So it's not a conversation. So make sure there's no sarcasm in the emails you send to an agency, no snark, no complaining about a company. All of that could be available to the company if what you're doing leads to litigation and they get interested. A good way that I always tell people to think about it is the newspaper test. Don't put anything in an email that you wouldn't want to see in the newspaper after a reporter makes a public records request. And the general email advice always applies. Review your email before you hit send. If it's an important email, maybe let it sit for a little bit before you hit send. You should always assume the target of the exam is going to read the email that you just sent. So again, don't complain about the company, don't complain about agency personnel. Always just be polite and concise. And if there's any question, pick up the phone. Make a phone call and do it over the phone. We're going to finish up this presentation discussing some common ethical issues that can arise at companies. Dan?
All right, thanks, Eric. So we're moving on to conflicts of interest, and I think we've talked a lot about conflicts of interest already. Obviously, they can happen at a company as well. So it's important to look at conflict of interest in terms of the company's overall tone at the top and corporate governance. Few examples that I've seen with conflicts of interest at companies, and usually what I've seen, it was examples where they were handling conflicts well. One of the companies had a code of ethics disclosure that the head of HR disclosed her husband owned a construction company, and they used that construction company for business improvements. The company had a specific process they used when they had to make improvements so that there wasn't an appearance of conflict of interest, and the person who was related to the construction firm wasn't part of that decision-making process. Another similar situation that I saw was at a company where one of the management team was married to someone who worked at a law firm that they used for outside counsel. And again, in that situation, they disclosed it, and the person wasn't involved in any of those discussions with the outside counsel. Eric, do you have any examples that you saw as an ethics prosecutor that were conflicts of interest that you want to share?
I've seen a couple as a receiver of companies. The one that comes to mind is when we're the receiver of family-owned insurance companies. Family members in those companies typically hold all the C-level positions. They comprise the board. They own the MGA, the premium finance company, and we've had cases where they own the company that provided IT services. A lot of times these companies are
point.
kind of set up. Yeah, they're kind of set up, you know, as a scheme to pull the money out of the insurance company, and although the conflicts are glaring, they're not necessarily illegal, but it's something to look at. I mean, everything is done for the benefit of the owners and the MGA company, and it's the company that suffers.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen, too, in these troubled companies that where the conflicts of interest really come into play is when the money starts getting less and less and less. And then each one of these entities is kind of fighting for their share of the pie. You know, in good times, the conflict of interest maybe isn't significant, but in bad times, that's where it really shows up a little bit more, I think.
Yep.
So,
there'll be intercompany contracts, you know, of course, but they're all signed by the same person. And when times get tough, you can bet which entity is going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to misuse of property. And Eric, do you want to share some examples there?
Sure. You know, everybody's familiar with this one. Generally, company property should not be used for non-company business. Most companies do allow for some incidental or limited use, personal calls or emails at work. But some of the big ones that you'll see are the use of the computer. One of the biggest things is just company employees copying the computer software and taking it home. Why pay for Microsoft Word when you can just get it from the company? Another glaring one is the company employee that is running a side business but using the company computer to run the side business. I don't know how often you see company cars these days, but typically there's a company car policy if somebody has a company car. Probably not all right to take the company car on vacation, but maybe it's okay to use it to drop the kids off on the way to school, on the way to work. If you've ever worked in a company with printers and copiers, you've probably seen someone in there printing up wedding invitations or garage sale flyers. That's obviously not okay. That's an ethical violation. And the misuse of the phone probably isn't as relevant today since we all have iPhones in our pocket, but in the old days, it was an issue with folks calling their relatives back in Spain or things like that. The one case I had as a prosecutor kind of shows what kind of cases we got at the Ethics Commission, since folks had to file a sworn complaint. But I did actually prosecute a small town mayor for using the town lawnmower to mow his own lawn, which was an ethical violation, but I don't think that's what folks had in mind when they wrote the ethics code in Florida. Do you have any, Jan, to add?
No, I think you covered pretty much what I was thinking. So let's move on to financial statement manipulation, because I know we have a ton of examples here from the work we've done at the troubled companies. So reasons this happens: incentive, it's easy, auditor relations. I think, you know, from what we've seen, a major reason why it happens is a company is getting in trouble and they don't want the regulators to know. So some examples of financial statement manipulation include exaggerating current period earnings by artificially inflating revenues and gains, or deflating current period expenses, minimizing current period earnings on the income statement by deflating revenue or inflating current period expenses, recording revenue prematurely or of questionable quality, recording fictitious revenue, increasing income with one-time gains, although I think statutory accounting would help to prevent that, shifting current expenses to an earlier or later period, which I think statutory accounting would also help to prevent, failing to record or improperly reducing liabilities, especially since they're estimates and it's easy to change the way that estimates are recorded, For example, typically a company would use the midpoint for reserves, but then they changed to using something below the midpoint for some reason, shifting current revenue to a later period. I think that statutory accounting helps to prevent that, and shifting future expenses, statutory accounting helps to prevent as well. Some examples that are kind of interesting, which we've seen typically at the troubled companies. The one classic and probably best example is reporting a surplus note without actually funding the note. So we saw that the company was in supervision. We saw that they had a surplus note on their books that just had come on at the end of the previous year. I think this was in March or April where we saw that. So we went to the accountant and talked about the funding of the note and asked him to show us the entry for funding the note. And he said, well, there wasn't any entry. It's just an IOU. So we talked to the general counsel and we took the annual statement in there and showed the footnote in the annual statement where it says that the surplus note was funded on December, I think it was 30th, with $3 million some dollars. And we said, $3 million in cash, it said. And we showed the general counsel the jurat page that she had signed, and we said, well, you signed that this annual statement was accurate, but here it says the surplus note was funded with cash, and you didn't fund it with cash. And the general counsel said, well, we intend to fund it if they need the money. Okay, well, that's a good example of financial statement manipulation right there. Another example that I have are reporting assets that should be not admitted as an admitted asset. And in this situation, the CEO was very proud of himself for speculating and that this asset was going to be worth 5 times what they paid for it later on. And we said, oh, but speculative investments are not admitted assets. So that again kind of tried to manipulate the financial statement. We've seen some other examples of cutting checks to pay the claims liability and then reducing the liability, but not actually mailing the check. And in this situation at the receivership, company in receivership, we found boxes and boxes of checks that hadn't been sent out yet, but they'd been marked as paid claims in the system and the liability had been reduced. We also have another company that would do weekly funding of claims, and due to cash flow and surplus concerns that they had, they were only paying the claims for the companies that were screaming the loudest. And that, while it wasn't necessarily financial statement manipulation, I think it was deception of the regulators in terms of how current the company really was in paying its claims. Another situation that I've seen was a company who used an auditor who lacked experience in statutory accounting, and I think, potentially, it's my opinion, that they were using this accountant because they knew that they wouldn't catch their statutory accounting errors. So, Eric, do you have some other examples you want to share on financial statement manipulation that we've seen?
I've got a couple that we've seen in our receiverships. One of them is booking reinsurance that doesn't appropriately transfer the risk. These are usually complicated and difficult to discover, but they're very dangerous for the company. There's lots of room to monkey around with the claims, improperly reserving or improperly closing claims. We've seen impaired assets where they book the asset, but unbeknownst to the regulator, they've gone to a bank and pledged that asset for a loan. We usually don't find that out until they're in receivership. And then with non-admitted assets, we've found a scheme. There's a company out there that offers to turn your non-admitted assets into admitted assets. And what they actually do is something like they say they'll buy the carpet in your building and lease it back to you. an obvious scheme, but as long as there's imaginative people out there, you can't guess what they're going to do. That's what I have. All right, our last one is use of insider information. So the most obvious use of insider info is insider trading, which is buying or selling a security, breach of a fiduciary duty or other relationship of trust and confidence on the basis of material, non-public information about the security. I just went on Google and found a couple cases that are relevant. In July, the SEC filed an insider trading charges against a CPA for a publicly traded company. She allegedly tipped off a friend with confidential information in advance of her company's quarterly reports. That scheme generated $6.2 million. And the SEC uncovered it with software. So they're out there looking. This is the classic insider trading story. Found another one from 2014 where an accountant was charged. They were given tax advice to a member of a restaurant chain's board of directors and discovered a pending takeover. And the SEC caught that one also. Other than insider trading, I had a different kind of case as a prosecutor for ethics in Florida, where the mayor of a small North Florida town learned his town was going to acquire a piece of property and build a new facility for the town. So he went out there and made a side deal to purchase the property so he could flip it to the town for a profit. What was interesting was he had no idea that was wrong. He thought he was just lucky to know that information. He admitted everything, and he actually went to trial and thought he was going to win. But of course he did not. Jan, I think you've got a couple other examples.
It appears that we are having a disconnect with our speaker, Jan.
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually think that we should just turn it over for the wrap-up instead of including any additional comments. So want to thank everybody for participating in this training. I know it's been a lengthy training, but it will be good for 2 CRE credits, which will fulfill your SOFHI ethics credit requirements. So I will turn it over for wrap-up. Thank you. Mary, do you want to wrap up with the housekeeping?
Certainly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a reminder on our housekeeping. SOFHI Continuing Regulatory Education CRE credits. This course is eligible for 2 credits. To receive credit and a CRE certificate, you must take the quiz located at the following URL. The link is the same link that is used for the SOFHI reading quizzes. So again, please make a note of the URL and access it to complete your quiz. Thank you so much for joining us for our presentation today. Our speakers were Eric Scott, and he can be reached at eric.scott@riskreg.com, and Jan Monk, who can be received at receive emails at jan.monk@riskreg.com. Again, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.